Members, it's the appointed time and we have a quorum. We are scrutinizing today the Road Traffic Registration and Licensing of Vehicles Amendment Number 2 Regulation 2024. We're going to have a discussion on this. Let's invite the government officials to join us. Government officials, when you're ready, I'll invite Mr. Edward Mack, Deputy Secretary for Transport and Logistics, to speak. There's going to be a PowerPoint presentation. Yes, Mr. Mack. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members. Good morning, everyone. This is the first meeting of the Subcommittee on Road Traffic Registration and Licensing of Vehicles Amendment Number 2, Regulation 2024. The purpose of this amendment regulation is to tighten the vehicle registration and licensing regime to deter registered owners from abandoning their unwanted vehicles improperly. We want to tackle the problem at source. Currently, for vehicles unlicensed for 2 years, the Transport Department would issue a notice to registered owners reminding them to license their vehicles. Owners who fail to relicense for their vehicles, the registration will be cancelled. And the owners will not be liable for the unlicensed vehicles. Some irresponsible owners exploit this loophole and abandon their vehicles on public roads and back alleys, causing environmental hygiene problems as well as congestion issues. We accept the recommendations made by the Office of the Ombudsman. That's why we're rolling out this amendment regulation. For vehicles that aren't licensed for 2 years, they will be continued to be registered under the owner's name. And within 3 months' time after the issue is noticed to owners, the owners fail to dismantle the vehicles or take the required actions, unless the owner has reasonable excuses. For example, the owner decided to keep the vehicle that is a vintage vehicle and is not going to be used on the road, then the owner will be penalized. We're happy to take actions. Thank you. Good morning, members. In September 2022, the Office of the Ombudsman published a direct investigation report on the problem of abandoned vehicles on government land. The Ombudsman asked us to take forward the legislative amendment exercise to stipulate that the registered owner of a vehicle should be responsible for the proper disposal of his vehicle, or else he will be held criminally liable. And in pursuing the legislative amendments, we are asked to consider including provisions to enable the government to recover from the persons concerned the costs incurred in disposing of the abandoned vehicles. Under the steer of the District Matters Coordination Task Force led by the Deputy Chief Secretary for Administration, the relevant government departments have stepped up efforts in conducting joint operations to clear up abandoned vehicles on public roads. From January 2021 to July 2024, over 480 interdepartmental joint operations were mounted, and over 3,300 abandoned vehicles have been removed. The number of abandoned vehicles removed in each joint operation in 2024 is half of that in 2021. About 90% of them are motorcycles. As mentioned in the opening remarks by the Deputy Secretary, there are 3 purposes to roll out this amendment regulation. First, we want to tackle the problem of abandoned vehicles at source by requiring vehicle owners to deregister their vehicles after properly dismantling. the vehicles instead of just dumping them. Second, to introduce an exemption arrangement under which vehicles owners who have genuine difficulties or good reasons for not licensing their vehicles may apply to the Commissioner for Transport for an exemption. Third, the penalty should induce sufficient deterrent effect. Currently, vehicles must be registered and licensed before they can be used on the road. A license fee is payable at the time of licensing. If a vehicle owner no longer wishes to have his or her vehicle registered in his or her name, he or she should either have the vehicle dismantled by a vehicle scrapping company or have the vehicle permanently shipped out of Hong Kong. For vehicles that have not been licensed for 2 years, the TD will issue a notice to the vehicle owner to remind him to renew the license. If the vehicle owner fails to renew the license within 15 days after the date of the notice, the registration of the vehicle will be cancelled. After legislative amendments, the registration of a vehicle which has not been licensed for 2 years will not be cancelled. The owner of a vehicle which has not been licensed for 2 years or more is required to relicense the vehicle within 3 months from the date of the notice issued by the TD, or cancel the registration of the vehicle with the TD after breaking up or permanently removing the vehicle as required. Failure to take action before the expiry of the 3-month notice period will constitute an offense. For vehicle owners who have a genuine difficulty in taking the required actions or has a good reason for not licensing their vehicles, they may apply to the Commissioner for an exemption. The amended legislation provides that the Commissioner must be satisfied that it's not reasonably practicable for the vehicle owner concerned to comply with the requirement. Examples of reasonable grounds include properly keeping a vintage vehicle that will not be used on road, vehicle pending spare parts for maintenance and vehicle examination, and vehicles stranded outside Hong Kong for certain reasons. For first conviction of the offense, the maximum penalty will be at level 3 and imprisonment for 3 months. For each subsequent conviction, the maximum penalty will be at level 4, that's $25,000, and imprisonment for 6 months. The penalty of the new offense is set higher than the general cost of breaking up or destroying a vehicle. It also reflects that costs are incurred for the government to clear abandoned vehicles. The court will order the Commissioner to refuse to issue or renew the driving license of a convicted registered owner, to refuse to issue a license to any vehicles under the convicted registered owner's name, to take no action on receipt of any notice of transfer of ownership of the vehicles under the convicted person's name unless and until the fine is paid. Currently, there are some legislations that adopt a similar approach. This includes the fixed penalty traffic contraventions ordinance, as well as the fixed penalty criminal proceedings ordinance, to allow sufficient time for registered owners to acquaint themselves with the amended regulation, the new exemption arrangement and related liabilities, and to take appropriate actions to dispose of vehicles unlicensed for 2 years. We intend to set the commencement date of the regulation by notice to be published in the Gazette at a later date. The new requirements will come into effect about 1 year after the enactment of the amended regulation. Before the commencement of the regulation, the Transport Department will not cancel the registration of vehicles unlicensed for 2 years or more. Registered owners of these vehicles are encouraged to license their vehicles in accordance with the original provisions or to properly dispose of their vehicles which have not been licensed for 2 years. Upon the commencement of the regulation, vehicles unlicensed for 2 years will be dealt with in accordance with the amendment regulation. We're going to have discussions on this amendment regulation. Members who have questions about this regulation, please press the request to speak button. 4 members have pressed the button. 5, including myself. There are Mr. Chen Xiu-hong, Mr. Frankie Yik, Mr. Kwok Wai-ke, Mr. Peter Xu, and myself. 5 minutes for each member, including questions and answers. Mr. Chen. There's been a lack of an effective penalty system, so there's a very low cost for registered owners to abandon their vehicles. While the government has been taking actions to clear up abandoned vehicles, it's not tackling the problem at source. Registered owners currently aren't held criminally liable if they abandon their vehicles. I support this amendment regulation because the government is trying to tackle the problem at source. I agree that there should be penalty for registered owners who fail to license their vehicles for 2 years or more to create a deterrent effect. There might be problems arising if they keep abandoning their vehicles. I want to ask about the penalty, the proportionality of the proposed penalty and the offense. Currently, on the first conviction, the maximum penalty is level 3 fine, that is $10,000 and a jail term of 3 months. And on each subsequent conviction, the maximum penalty will be a level 4 fine, that is $25,000 and an imprisonment of 6 months. Is this proposed penalty too heavy and not proportionate with the offense committed? I want to know which legislations or regulations the government drew reference from to come up with this penalty. Also, how are you going to define abandoned vehicles? I'm asked these questions by a number of people. You may have a vehicle with a registration mark parked on the public road. Say all the tires of a vehicle have been removed and the registered owner of that vehicle is not licensed and that vehicle is abandoned in a deserted area. Are you going to prosecute that owner for improperly disposing of that vehicle? The government amended the relevant legislations last year. Anyone who litters will be liable for a fine of $6,000. Some people may say this is not a vehicle, it is just a large piece of junk. Are you going to prosecute that person and impose a fine of $6,000, or are you going to penalize that owner under this regulation? Mr. Mack. On the issue of proportionality, we've talked to the DOJ as well as the Transport Department. We have made careful considerations. We drew reference from a couple of legislations, including the penalty on obstructions. We made reference to the summary offense ordinance. Anyone who causes obstruction on the streets will be liable to a fine of $25,000 at level 4 and a jail term of 3 months. Now we're talking about Cap 374 of the Hong Kong law, that is the road traffic ordinance. To give you some examples, currently we are imposing a level 3 fine, that's $10,000. For those who drive under the influence of alcohol or drug, they will be asked to pay this fine. Or those who refuse to take alcohol test, they're also liable to a level 4 fine. Level 3 fine. Normally, we impose a level 3 fine as well as a jail term of 6 months on these offenses. Like the Ombudsman said, we need to set a higher level of penalty. That is a cost higher than breaking up a vehicle to create a deterrent effect.
The second point is that the government commits a vast amount of resources to the clearance of vehicles, so that should be factored in. The jail terms here are not as tough as under the other pieces of legislation. Now, I want to give the floor to my colleague from the Transport Department to tell us more. For dumped cars, we consider the location, the status, or the condition of the car such that people can reasonably believe that car has been dumped. Say the movement permit is no longer there, or the movement permit has already expired. Or maybe the tires are already flat, the car is dirty with dust covering the entire car. Before a joint operation, the Transport Department puts out a notice. When that happens and the car owner does nothing, we still allow time for the owner to remove the car. But then after the notice is put out and then after multiple visits, the car is still there, we treat that car as a dumped car. And that car will become a target for removal during our joint operation. Chairman, my concern is you put out the notice, you mount the joint operation. But the question is, the car owner argues that it's a piece of bulky waste, so you cannot prosecute that person under this regulation. Instead, you have to prosecute with the charge of disposing a bulky item of waste. So you take away the wheels, that car is still a car. Now we can find the chassis number or other details, and we can find the owner. We can still prosecute that person under this regulation. So the key is that the car is registered. Whatever condition that car may be, that car remains a car. So the current law is that 2 years and then this person does nothing, the car is deregistered. You cannot trace the owner, and you cannot tell whether that's a car or a piece of bulky waste. But now with the amendment, things will be clearer. That car can be traced back to the owner, so that offers clarity. Thank you. Mr. Frankie Yik. From the slides, there was a reference to vintage cars. Some people in the sector came to me looking for clarity. So people wonder, say, I abandoned the car. That car is in a public place. That should be caught by this regulation. But if I put the car in a warehouse or on a brownfield site, it's a vintage car. I don't renew the license. I just look at the car every now and then. I don't renew the license because that car isn't supposed to hit the road. Will I be caught by this regulation? That's the first question. Now, Mr. Chen Xiuhong asked about the proportionality of the penalty, but I have the reverse concern. The court usually hands down a sentence more lenient than the maximum penalty. The scrapping of a car costs a lot of money these days. The court may end up fining the culprit $1,000. That's cheaper than scrapping a car. So will that mean the law can still work? You're handing the power to the court. How can you make sure this law works? Deputy Secretary. Thank you. Now, vintage cars. As the Deputy Commissioner said, when it's a registered car, that car remains under the name of an owner, and that owner fails to have the car's license renewed, and that car is still in a public place or on a private site, that owner has to apply for an exemption. A car is licensed, it's on a private site, that car remains subject to this registration requirement. We propose a 1-year grace period before the new regulation takes effect because the Transport Department will send out forms telling people how to apply for that exemption. We will ensure clarity. in that requirement, we will set up clearly what supporting documents are needed, and there will be a swift way to get the paperwork done. Now, the penalties. We have talked to the industry. Scrapping a car, depending on your car, can cost anywhere between $500 to $2,000. We considered this cost. We consider the maximum penalty, and the court has its own reasons in handing down judgments. So we have factored in these elements. Mr. Frankie Yick. So the Deputy Secretary is saying you can put a car in a warehouse on a private site. You just look at the car. Still, that car is subject to this new requirement that is relicensing. People can apply for an exemption or rather an extension. So isn't that needless hassle for law-abiding citizens? I simply love the car. I'm not driving the car on the road. Isn't that disruptive for people? Thank you. When the car is first shipped to Hong Kong, that car is registered, it has a license, it has been running on the road. Once that is done, and then this car becomes a vintage car, it will not harm road traffic. It will be kept as an object people simply look at. The owner will have to apply for an exemption under the new rules. But when the car is bought as a vintage car and put on a private site, that car has never been licensed. In that case, this new regulation will not cover that car. Got it. But you have yet to address the concern from the industry. Say, I bought a vintage car. I show my car. I drive my car maybe 12 years, a year, but then afterwards I decide to leave that car in a warehouse. I simply look at the car. So I apply for an exemption. I still have to go through the paperwork, but don't ask me to go through the paperwork every 2 years. The government will threaten to revoke the exemption if I don't apply for an exemption every 2 years. Transport Department. The exemption period may not be 2 years. With supporting documents, the exemption can be longer than 2 years. On vintage cars, when the car is well kept, we can give a longer exemption period. But the owner will have to provide us with timely information to make sure that car is well kept. We can explore a longer exemption period. Say that this car owner wants to deregister the car and keep that car in a warehouse. Can we make the paperwork one-off? The TD shouldn't bother the owner. I just keep the car in the warehouse. You need flexibility. Some people in Hong Kong have more than a dozen vintage cars. Those cars don't hit the roads. And now the new rules will mean regular re-registration. And that's a hassle. So Ms. Kwok or Mr. Mack, on deregistration, the law as it stands is that deregistration requires first going to a scrapping company, taking the car apart, or submitting paperwork proving the car will be shipped out for good. So now the law only allows these two options for you to deregister a car. Otherwise, you get the problem you have now. The car is left on the street. That's why deregistration gives you two options. First, you have the car taken apart, or you have the car shipped out for good. Chairman, I get what the new law is doing. With the new regulation, you want to prevent improper disposal of cars on the street. We fully support that. But there's an issue that goes unaddressed. There are vintage car lovers. They are struggling with this new rule. So we need a change. You should allow people to deregister a car and let those owners keep the vintage cars in a warehouse? Why not allow people to keep those vintage cars simply for their collection? So in your exemption, can you give a really long exemption period? Maybe more than 10 years. So people simply keep the car that is the vintage car in private. Can we do that? Or the car is already in a museum? Deputy Secretary. Indeed, that's a pragmatic option. The spirit of the law is that when the law empowers the Transport Department to grant an exemption, there can be conditions attached to the exemption under Cap 1 of the law. The conditions can be kept simple. Some conditions may be requiring the submission of documents, and that can lead to a longer exemption. Or a requirement to notify the government when there's a change of circumstances, and when people breach that condition, enforcement can follow. There can be a requirement to notify the government of a change in circumstances. That can be done. Those people love their vintage cars. Mr. Kwok Wai-keung. Thank you, Chairman. This amendment is long overdue. The current regulation is absurd in some ways. So you let the car go unlicensed for 2 years, and then you will no longer be liable for that car. This leaves people wonder. People wonder why. In our district work, we see abandoned cars in rear lanes, mostly motorbikes. Before COVID, I visited Shingmun Reservoir. There was an unlicensed private car full of dust, obviously a dumped car. It's a serious problem. The government cleared many cars during operations at black spots, but we have to guard against the recurrence of such a problem, and I think this amendment will work. Paragraph 11 of the paper is interesting. It says, the amendment will take effect a year after enactment. There will be a 1-year transitional period. In that year, no automatic deregistration will happen for cars left unlicensed for 2 years. So people wonder, why a 1-year transitional period, such a long period? Now, when the new regulation takes effect in a year's time and these owners, irresponsible owners, do not act, there's nothing you can do. You cannot penalize them. So isn't this grace period needless? Why not have the regulation take effect immediately? Some car owners may want to dump their car right now, so they exploit that 1-year grace period and they dump their cars in that grace period. Why create this loophole? Can we move faster? Chairman.
Mr. Mack. Thank you, Chair. On the 1-year grace period, this is what we're going to do. After this subsidiary legislation is scrutinized and endorsed by members of the Council, in mid-December, we will officially finish the scrutiny of this subsidiary legislation and we will make this amendment regulation public. Then we will cease the previous arrangement, that is allowing people to automatically cancel the registration of their cars after 2 years. Then 1 year later, we will publish a notice, and this amendment regulation will take effect. During this 12-month period, we encourage registered owners to properly dispose of their vehicles instead of dumping them in back alleys or on public roads and land. So 1 year later, this amendment regulation will come into operation. So during this 1 year window, the abandoned vehicles will be included in our list or notice. Well, Mr. Kwok asked why we are implementing this 1 year interim period. We're not allowing owners who have the intention to abandon their vehicles 1 year period. Instead, we are encouraging owners to get exemption and get acquainted with the new arrangement. We want them to be familiar with what kind of documents they have to submit. And we want them to have time to get prepared. That's why we're proposing this 1 year transitional period. Can you clarify this? Within this 1 year period, if an owner abandons his vehicle, then he will be subject to some consequences. Yes, because during this 1 year period, this regulation will apply to any owners who abandon their vehicles. Thanks for clarifying. Well, during this 1 year period, the amendment regulation is not officially in effect. We've talked to the Department of Justice, and under the amendment regulation, we will only handle the case if the owner does not dispose of the vehicle after not licensing their vehicles for 2 years. Let me supplement. Under the current amendment regulation, we will issue a notice to owners. And within 15 days, and the owner does not take any required action, the commissioner may cancel the registration. So after the commencement of this amendment regulation, will not activate this cancellation system. We will, in accordance with the law of the Lands Department, to deal with the abandoned vehicles. Mr. Peter Xu. I support this amendment regulation. Some irresponsible owners of motorbikes and private cars, they abandon their vehicles on the roads, and this causes a lot of disturbance. So this amendment regulation is holding these owners accountable. I believe most members of the public support this amendment. Some scrapping companies, they buy and sell secondary cars or second-hand cars. They may not be able to sell these second-hand cars or high-end cars immediately. And these cars do not get licensed. And after a period of time, the car may be tested on the road with a P license. And the person who buys this car will be responsible for the car. However, this car may be left in the company for some time. Would this be a very high cost for the company? Thank you, Mr. Xu. Some second-hand cars may not be sold immediately. If these cars are proven that they will be kept properly and that they won't affect road safety, we will consider granting an exemption to these cars. If all the documents are ready, we will approve the exemption in 10 working days. However, it depends on how many applications we get and whether the documents required are ready. Let's see if the Transport Department has anything to add about the cost. We're not going to charge any fees for this kind of exemption applications, and we will deal with these applications as soon as possible. Upon the expiry of the 3-month period, you will officially instigate prosecution, right? So during the 3-month period, how are you going to ensure that you can reach the registered owner concerned? Say a registered owner may own lots of cars and they may lend their cars to their families and friends, and they do not manage these cars on their own. They may have forgotten that they have these cars. How are you going to ensure that during the 3-month window you can reach these owners? Deputy Commissioner, we will, in accordance with the current legislation, by ordinary post, send a notice to the owner concerned. We'll also reach out to the owner electronically. We've already collected the electronic contact means of all owners. We will within 30 days of the expiry of the license, as well as 2 years after the expiry of the license, contact the owners. So the owners will get it by post as well as by email. So you're not going to issue the notice by registered post? No. So you'll have to step up publicity to remind vehicle owners about their liabilities. They have to be aware that they will be held criminally liable and may be subject to a jail term if they violate the regulation. Mr. Rincon, I in principle support this amendment regulation. I have a couple of questions. A number of cars, they are registered under companies. For law-abiding citizens, as well as individual registered owners, this won't be a problem. For some companies, however, they do not intend to violate the law, but they may be liquidated. Will this cause a loophole? How are you going to hold these companies accountable under the amendment regulation? Another question is about the joint operations. I find this regulation quite special. You are penalizing those who abandon vehicles through the registration system. You are not tracing the owners who abandoned the vehicles when you find an abandoned car. Say someone litters and you catch that person. However, currently you are going to, through the registration system, catch the person that violates the law. I agree with what Mr. Frankie Yek said about the exemption arrangement. We want to revive the economy. Purchase and sales of second-hand cars, as well as transfer of vintage cars, they can be a very big market. I understand that you are going to roll out this exemption arrangement. However, the government can exercise discretion, and the discretions aren't set out in the amendment regulation. You were saying that under certain circumstances, you may grant exemptions. This is vague. How are people going to know what are some of the examples where you may grant exemptions? Would you give blanket waiver, for example? take second-hand car companies or car companies as examples, or for vintage car collectors, are you going to grant special exemptions to these people? I'm afraid that they may forget to apply for exemptions. Say vintage car collectors, they may have dozens of vintage cars. Do you have to remind them every day to apply for exemptions? This is time consuming. Mr. Chen Xiuhong asked about fixed penalty. Have you thought about imposing fixed penalties instead, so that these cases won't have to go through courts every time? Now, if you have a non-compliant registered owner, he or she will have to go to the court. This can be a burden for both the court and the non-compliant owner. Also, what about bicycles? Many people who deliver food, they are on bikes. How come you're so stringent with registered owners of vehicles, but not to those who own a bike? Mr. Mack. For cars registered under companies, well, in Hong Kong, most of the registered vehicles are registered under individuals. Of course, there are also a number of cars registered under companies. When we draft the regulation, we have thought about this. For cars registered under companies, we can ask the company to pay the fine if the company violates the regulation. Say the company closes down, the government can, in the capacity as a debtor or creditor, ask the company to pay the fine. In these cases, the court would see whether the directors of the company had the intent to break the law by abandoning the vehicles concerned. These are things that the court would look at. On the joint operations, it's not ideal that we only hold the vehicle owners accountable after we find abandoned vehicles. Abandoned vehicles can cause a lot of problems, including obstruction of fire escape. So we're amending this regulation because we want to tackle the problem at source. We don't want owners to abandon their vehicles on public roads. We've talked to the Department of Justice. Say an owner fails to relicense the vehicle or scrap the vehicle after the 3-month period, we will not cancel the registration of that owner. However, if the owner continues to ignore the notice, we will prosecute the owner pursuant to the Land Miscellaneous Provisions Ordinance. So we are going to make use of different ordinances and legislations to deal with cases like these.
Now, on the exemption, we try to make life easier when it comes to the exemption for car owners. Once we build up the experience, we will be in a better position to tell the car owners how the exemption works. Now, the provision is that once the commissioner thinks it is not reasonably practicable to get the relicensing the commissioner can grant exemption. We want to make life easier for the public. And then once we have more experience, we can look at the experience, we can find examples, and then we can let the public know when they can expect an exemption. I now turn to the fixed penalty. We did give thought to that option. Fixed penalties apply to minor traffic contraventions or littering. That's when fixed penalties work best. Now, in this case, the fines are tougher with jail terms. We stick to this approach instead. The matter has to go through a court. On bicycles, there is no licensing and registration for bicycles. That's why bikes are outside the scope of this amendment. Still, bikes are top of mind for us too. We do joint operations with the Home Affairs Department and the Lands Department. Again, we invoke the Land Miscellaneous Provisions Ordinance. When bikes pose an immediate threat or risk to road traffic, the police force can take action by invoking the Summary Offences Ordinance. Those bikes can be removed. We will also look for ways to do better on enforcement against offences involving bikes. Mr. Chen Hockfeng, I'm all for this amendment. In real lanes, you can see motorbikes. Users of motorbikes complain that those abandoned motorbikes take up the space. In rural areas, abandoned vehicles are everywhere, nobody does anything, and that becomes an environmental hygiene issue. So I support this amendment. Now, here are my questions. The new rule will take effect only 1 year after enactment. With the current law, a car goes unlicensed for 2 years and then the car is deregistered. So what do you do about the cars? Now, will there be a major operation to clear the cars under the current rules? Now, many people mentioned vintage cars. I know you will stop issuing licenses for diesel cars from 2035 onwards. Will the government consider issuing vintage car licenses? That is, licenses for cars that meet requirements, and then this license can be valid forever. In that case, you can save the hassle with getting an exemption. And then you can also fix the problem with the 2035 time limit. Can we consider options along that route? Now, when you have a company and that company goes bust, you can still hold that company to account. Now, I want to see if I'm getting this right. Would this mean lifelong liability until that car is deregistered? So unless this person dies, as long as this car does not get deregistered and this car is not scrapped, the person involved remains liable until that person passes away. Is that the case? Mr. Edward Mack. I thank Mr. Chen for his questions. In clearing dumped cars, with the leadership, or rather under the leadership of the Deputy Chief Secretary, we started the operations. We stepped up the work in 2021. Thousands of cars have been cleared. We will continue with the joint operations. In more recent operations, with repeated efforts from us, the cars we cleared now have fallen by half from before, but we will stick to such operations. Cars block rear lanes and fire escape routes. We have to fix those problems quickly. Now, vintage cars. We want to make life easier for the owners. on ideas we can pursue as we consider ways to deal with old cars. We can give thought to ways to make life easier for owners. This time we propose an exemption mechanism. We will get a better sense of the number of cars and the conditions of those cars. And this will help us with coming up with ideas for future amendments. Now, on cars registered under companies, we may be able to secure convictions under the new rules. The cars don't get deregistered by default. That's because we have to make sure that car is taken apart or shipped out for good. That's the safe way to go. Otherwise, we want that car to be linked to an owner. So the same principle goes for the company. We will pursue that company. So as long as that car isn't properly dealt with, the person involved remains criminally liable until this person passes away. Is that the case? So you either ship out the car for good or scrap the car and pay the fines. If this person doesn't pay the fine, the liability remains. Is that the case? So say we secure a conviction, that person will have to pay the fines. Jail terms may even apply. If this person fails to pay the fines, the proposal will come with further restrictions on transfer of ownership. When the fine is paid, but that car isn't properly disposed of, in that case, the deregistration doesn't happen. The person remains liable. So will you prosecute the person again? We will follow other ordinances. Say it's the same car, and that car blocks public places. And then we can invoke the Land Miscellaneous Provisions Ordinance. And even under this ordinance, we can look at the gravity of the circumstances and then pursue prosecution. We have talked to the Department of Justice about this. So how long would it take for you to decide whether to prosecute the person again? There were no clear provisions on that. We have to look at the circumstances. We have to talk to the Department of Justice about whether to prosecute that person again. It depends on the circumstances. Ms. Chan Hao-yen. In principle, I support the regulation. But then on details and the exemption, I have some further questions. For many abandoned cars, they're in rear lanes under flyovers. They take up spaces. There are many such cars in Shamshui-Po. Cars are blocked. There are hygiene issues. The new regulation will take effect a year after enactment. The car has to be left unlicensed for more than 2 years. We get complaints. You have to wait 2 years. The car goes unlicensed for 2 years, and then the car gets deregistered. But if there are environmental hygiene issues and there are safety hazards, what will you do? Do you have that car towed away first, or do you have to wait for 2 years? Do you first have that car towed away and then you deregister the car? Now, the car owner. People emigrate. They leave the car unattended. They just move out of town. The government said 30 days before and on the day, a letter will go to the owner by ordinary post. So are you saying there's nothing you can do in those 2 years? The car is abandoned for a long time. You can see fixed penalty tickets all over the windscreen. Now I turn to vintage cars. The government just said it would consider all these options. The commissioner would consider practicable options. So here's an idea. Don't just consider. Can we carve out a new option for vintage or precious cars? Can you create this specific kind of license? I've seen cars with a special design. People keep the car there. They just look at the car. Can we have a special kind of license for vintage cars of a certain vintage? Or when you have a special car simply for collection purposes, can we carve out a special arrangement? Otherwise, the commissioner will have its plate full. You have to review the length of exemption. There are expos of vintage cars in Hong Kong. In Yao Chin Mong last year, there was such an expo. There are such cars. Since other members have already argued along the same line, can we create a new kind of license? Wouldn't that work better? Mr. Mack. Deputy Commissioner for Transport, Ms. Candy Kwok. Thank you. Now, for serious cases, cars blocking rear lanes, those cars will be dealt with during joint operations. If the member has particular locations in mind, she can share those details with us so that we can focus on those areas for our operations. When that car is still registered, we can find the car owner and then we go after the car owner under the Land Miscellaneous Provisions Ordinance. I get it. What if you cannot find the owner? Of course, you get the owner to move away when you can find the owner. What if you have an owner who has emigrated? You simply do ordinary post. There's another approach for summonses. For ordinary post, we are simply using it to remind the owner to have the car relicensed. I'm saying the car owner has left. The car owner has moved out of town. What do you do? The owner has abandoned the car. That person has left Hong Kong, and that person is unresponsive. What do you do? So we follow the law on people who fail to show up in court. You still have to deal with the car. For a car that's left unlicensed for 2 years, and then you remind the owner, you're assuming that person still wants to keep the car, but I'm talking about someone who just leaves the car on the street. What do you do, Mr. Mack? Say the car is left unlicensed for 2 years, or the car has already been deregistered. Then we have the car towed away. So you move that car away. Yes, we will do that. So we move that car away first so that the road is cleared, the alley is cleared. We move that car away, and then we try to find the registered car owner. Without such an owner, we follow the existing mechanism. We deal with the car. The car may be auctioned off. There's a procedure for that. But if there is a registered owner, we find that owner. The member wondered, what if you cannot find the owner? So again, we follow the court procedures. We prosecute the owner. First, we notify this person to attend the court hearing. And if this person cannot be found, we follow the current prosecution procedures. The member also mentioned 30 days before the license expires, we remind the owner. And then within 3 months after the expiry, we remind the owner again. I think there are 3 occasions on which we remind the owner. 30 days before, on the day, 3 months afterwards. We do ordinary mail, ordinary post. That's in line with what we do under other ordinances. We also send text messages. We are gathering the email addresses and phone numbers of car owners. That's their electronic contact means. We can notify the owner through those means. The Transport Department is rolling out a platform. It's a one-stop portal. Once owners register on this platform, they get push notifications. So we try different means such that even owners who are overseas can be notified.
A follow-up question. Say I am a car owner and I give the TD my phone number and email address. When I give such information, the TD will not check or verify whether the information is correct. When I apply for e-tolls, I mistakenly gave TD a wrong phone number because of bad handwriting. So I know that the TD did not check on the spot whether the phone number provided by me was correct. You're going to reach out to the owners through email or text messages. So you have to verify the accuracy of the information. And please respond to my questions about precious cars and vintage cars. Would you come up with a licensing system for these cars? Ms. Kwok. Like the Deputy Secretary said, under the proposed amendment regulation, we will have an exemption arrangement. This allows the Commissioner for Transport to give written permission to owners. This exemption period can span over a long period of time. We'll see if it is necessary for us to further amend the regulation. We will take into consideration all practicable examples and we will list them out on our website. Through time, we may be able to accrue more examples or scenarios where we should grant exemptions to owners. So we will continue to update our list of exemptions examples. Mr. Paul Chair. Thank you, Chair. The legal advisor asked some questions, and the reply was given by the administration. I'm quite concerned about the policy intent of the amendment. Paragraph 6 targets obstruction, and I understand that this regulation targets those irresponsible car owners, and that's why all members are in support of this amendment. Say for littering, we hold the person who litters accountable. For abandoned vehicles, it is a tricky situation. It's hard for you to track down the vehicle owner directly. There are newly proposed penalties under the amendment. And previously, members asked about how the administration will deal with vintage cars. If you go to the conventions and exhibition hall, you see that there are lots of cars parked there, and they're owned by wealthy people. I also know a lot of people who keep their cars in their garage, and they do not use these cars at all, and these cars aren't licensed either. So this amendment is targeting irresponsible owners who abandon their vehicles on the road. Why don't you instigate prosecution only when you spot an abandoned vehicle? Say, private cars that do not cause any obstructions. How are you going to deal with them? Maybe you don't need to do anything about that. we are under a common law system. You need to have a clear goal if you enact a piece of legislation. Understand you cannot have an exhaustive list of exemptions. However, you should not wait until you gather more evidence to see what you are going to do and whether you are going to grant exemptions. You may want to shelve this amendment regulation if you haven't thought through this. Otherwise, it will set a bad precedent. There are abandoned buildings on brownfield sites. How come you do not adopt the same approach to deal with abandoned vehicles? Second question. About notifying registered owners. You said that there might be serious cases and there might be less serious cases. Registered owners who abandoned vehicles might be subject to very heavy penalty. And you are saying that magistrates can give draconian orders, asking the commissioner not to renew the driving licenses or vehicle licenses of the convicted person. However, you apply a different standard when you notify owners. When you issue notices, you're only doing that by ordinary post. Like Ms. Chen said, you do not verify the owner's contact information. So is this behavior so serious that warrants a very stringent way to issue the notice, or are you simply issuing the notice by ordinary post? Also, as mentioned, you have to give a very clear definitions of under what circumstances you are going to grant exemptions. For example, I have a car that is a dozen years old, and I don't use the car often, and I just keep it at my home. Can I not apply for exemption? You say that there is going to be a 1-year grace period. Can you further amend your regulation to make sure that this regulation is well thought through before you enact it? Mr. Mack. We want to, through this amendment, tackle the problem of irresponsible, abandoned vehicles at source. We are targeting those irresponsible owners. We want to come up with a mechanism that provides convenience to law-abiding citizens. We want to, where appropriate, grant exemptions to the law-abiding citizens. We want this mechanism to be straightforward. We want to set out circumstances under which we would grant exemptions. As mentioned, we may grant exemptions to owners of vintage car as long as we ensure that the cars would be kept properly and that it would not cause safety hazards. As we launch our publicity campaign, we will provide some examples. As long as you provide certain documents, we can ensure that your cars won't cause safety hazards and will be kept properly. Like Mr. Peter Xu said, some cars may be consigned to certain car companies for sale, and the car may not be sold for 2 years. Also, some cars are pending special spare parts, and we grant exemptions to owners of these types of vehicles. We will set out clear examples to explain to the public about how we're going to enforce the law. We want to strike a balance. We might not be able to set out all these details in the amendment regulation because we want to ensure that there will be flexibility. That's why we want to come up with examples for the public to understand how they can apply for exemptions. Some members asked about how we're going to deal with vintage cars, whether there is going to be a mechanism for us to deal with vintage cars. Will there be a licensing regime for vintage cars? We will consider this. We will consider whether we can lengthen the exemption period. We will offer some examples to car owners. Owners have to prove to us that they are going to keep their cars properly. If there is change of circumstances, owners should notify us, and we will grant exemptions. Moving forward, after we've gathered enough information, we may consider setting up a mechanism for vintage cars. We're going to adopt a progressive or incremental approach. So we do want to benefit owners of vintage cars. In terms of issuance of notice, we have drawn reference from other legislations. There are different ways for us to issue notices, say by ordinary post or by registered post. We find that mailing these notices by ordinary post would be adequate. This is because we're also reaching out to owners through electronic means. We will verify the electronic contact means of owners. We'll also verify the phone numbers provided by owners to make sure that the notices will reach the registered owners concerned. We're rolling out a platform. Owners can open an account on this platform to check the status. We also will send text messages to owners so that owners will be aware of the status of their cars. I hope this answers members' questions. As far as I understand, currently there is no mechanism that can ensure vehicle owners dispose of their cars properly. Is there a mechanism to recover the costs if the government has to help remove the abandoned vehicle? There is no such mechanism under the existing legislations. We mount joint operations and it takes up the government resources. We use public money to mount these operations, and there is no mechanism for us to recover the costs from the registered owners concerned. Say, for the police, they can track down the owners concerned. However, for owners who have already deregistered their vehicles, there's no way for us to hold the owners accountable. That's why we are proposing to amend the regulation so that we do not cancel the registration by default. We're setting a high penalty so that it is higher than the cost of disposing of the vehicles.
Now, other members may want to ask follow-up questions on this too. Now we turn to Mr. Benson Look. Thank you. The government is trying to come up with pragmatic administrative arrangements. I want to address the aspiration, the thinking behind this regulation. the point is to target illegally abandoned cars. Paragraph 8 of the paper sets out the current position. The car goes on license for 2 years, and then within 15 days, the owner has to have that car relicensed. Otherwise, the car gets deregistered and the owner will no longer be held liable. Owners exploit this loophole and they dump their cars, such as the motorbikes, in rear lanes. So here are my questions. The Deputy Secretary told us, with the current rules, you lose track of the owner. We first leave aside the penalties. Can we find a way for us to trace the person who dumped the cars? We are combating the dumping of such cars. The proposal is about targeting the owner because we cannot find the person who dumps the car. But technology-wise, can we trace the car to the person who dumps it? And should we also be stiffening the penalty for abandoning the cars? The proposal now seems something that creates a hassle for law-abiding citizens, such as people with vintage cars. Those are law-abiding citizens. We're making life harder for law-abiding citizens. Can we truly tackle the dumping of cars? The penalty here turns on registration, not dumping. So what does the government think? Shouldn't we be targeting the people who dump the cars? Thank you. I agree with Mr. Lok. We are grappling with the matter at source. We should also step up the work on the dumping, such as considering stiffer penalties. We have seen some recent amendments, and that amendment has to do with obstructing public places. Stiffer penalties have been brought in under the Summary Offences Ordinance. When someone obstructs a public place, the fine is now at level 4 plus 3 years of imprisonment. In clearing illegally dumped cars, we invoke the Land Miscellaneous Provisions Ordinance. Under that ordinance, there were provisions for cars causing obstruction. So we step up the clearance of cars. We have stiffer penalties. Now we turn to the source who want to reduce cars that are dumped. So this is our multi-pronged approach. Just then there was a question about Ms. Candy Kwok. For a deregistered car, we cannot find the owner. We can find the previous owner once that car is deregistered. But once a car is deregistered, the previous owner is no longer the current owner. We can simply find the previous owner before the deregistration from our record. I hope that answers the question. The member was asking whether the technology allows us to trace the car to an owner. No follow-up questions. Next, it's my turn, and then there will be a few members speaking for the second round. So we will do a second round. If you haven't pressed the button but wish to speak, please press the button now. This is a long-standing problem. We've seen media reports about this problem. In rural areas, on private lots, we often find abandoned cars. A member wondered whether we can leave cars on private land alone. That's not possible. In the new territories, you don't have wires, barriers. On private sites, cars are abandoned. The owners don't want abandoned cars sitting on their land. So leaving cars on private land alone will give rise to other problems. We had a discussion about exemption. Now, someone, say, has the exemption. Can this person sell that car? When someone else buys it, will the new buyer inherit that exemption? Say for a vintage car with an exemption, the seller sells the car to the buyer. The buyer has a certificate saying they have now are the new owner of a car with an exemption. So can someone inherit the exemption? Now, there's a transaction at the car dealership, or the car may be left with the car dealership. You leave the car for 2 years, the car remains unsold, the dealership has to apply for an exemption. And then when relicensing is needed, the car needs to be checked again before getting the license. The dealership may simply have cars that other people want to sell. That car is placed with the dealership. But those owners have yet to transfer the ownership to the dealership. And then the owner goes missing in action. The car is with the dealership. And the dealership does not have the exemption because the dealership cannot apply for the exemption. What do? In this case, you need the owner to apply for the exemption. Now, another matter is the clearance. It will take a while before the new regulation takes effect. You still see many cars in urban areas and rural areas. So will there be a massive clearance operation before the new regulation takes effect? Without such clearance, people are left wondering what difference the new regulation can make. Will the government undertake a large-scale joint operation to clear the cars? Now, on the costs of clearance, other departments recover the fees for clearance operations. Say our banners got damaged by people. The departments recover those fees. So is the lands department illegally charging or recovering fees? Still, the lands charges me for damaged banners. Why should taxpayers foot the bill for clearance operations involving cars that are abandoned irresponsibly? Mr. Edward Mack. On the exemption and reselling of cars, and when the owner asks a dealership to sell the car on their behalf, the Deputy Commissioner for Transport can respond to those questions in a moment. On clearing dumped cars, we will carry on with the interdepartmental joint operations. During such operations, we look at the complaints we get. When departments spot serious blockage, and then the departments will find those places and then they conduct the operations. When we see many such abandoned cars, we focus on those areas first. On recovering the fees for clearance operations, we don't have such a mechanism. The police force has such an arrangement on their side, but we will certainly pass this message to the departments to see whether this is feasible. On cost recovery, we have to talk to the departments in charge of public finance. If it's about cost recovery, we may not even need a statutory provision. Now over to the Transport Department, Ms. Candy Kwok. On exemption, this applies to current car owners. When the car is sold, say after the transfer of ownership, the new owner has to apply for the exemption afresh. Because we have to consider whether the new owner is keeping that car properly. So the new owner still has to apply for the exemption. Now, Ms. Amy Lee will take the other question. Now, on owners putting their car with the dealership for sale, the exemption applies to the current owner. When a car is with a second-hand car dealership, license fees apply. We have been in touch with such dealerships. Now, when there's no payment of license fees, there's a 2-year period when needed. The cars come with a P plate and then for a test drive. The owner has to prove that the car is with a dealership for sale, and the owner has to prove that the car is properly kept. In such case, we can grant the exemption on the grounds that the car is properly kept and it's kept in a responsible way. 5 members are waiting to speak for the second round. Any other members? I have to manage the time. 5 members will speak for the second round, and then we will see whether we can start the clause-by-clause scrutiny. Mr. Chen Xiuhong. Thank you, Chairman. This proposal marks a fundamental change. You either scrap the car or ship out the car for good. Otherwise, you leave the car unlicensed for 2 years, that car becomes deregistered. But with the new regulation, the car does not get deregistered by default. So with the new rules, how do we deregister a car? There's a gap. A car comes in, it's registered. You can never deregister the car again until you scrap the car or ship out the car. So members are worried. Some people keep vintage cars, or they simply keep the car. They keep the car. With the new regulation, there is no option for people to deregister a car simply to keep the car. That car doesn't hit the road again. So in this 1-year period, can we have clearer guidelines? Once you meet certain conditions, the Commissioner for Transport can deregister a car. Now, in that case, the car will need to be checked and it needs to get the certificate of roadworthiness. So can the Deputy Commissioner consider this option to allay our concerns? Now I turn to my second question. It's about the notice from the Transport Department. This notice will go to owners through ordinary post. There will be an electronic reminder. My concern is this. Some people leave Hong Kong for work for 2 or 3 years. Not every car owner provides their electronic contact means. Ordinary post is no good for an owner who's out of town. So 2 or 3 years from now, the owner comes back and they realize they have committed a criminal offense and they may have to go to jail. You should not just rely on ordinary post and the registered electronic contact means. Can we have a mechanism for owners to appeal? How do we deal with such cases? Now, I turn to my third question. To ensure enough deterrence, the penalty will be higher than the cost for scrapping a car. So let's look at the latest figures based on abandoned cars handled by the government. So how much does scrapping a car or handling an abandoned car cost in terms of administrative expenses? We need that figure to justify the fines.
Mr. Mack. Thank you, Chairman. First, on the issuance of notice. During the 1-year interim period, we will issue guidelines to set out clearly under what circumstances we will grant exemptions. We will think about under what circumstances we can allow the registration of vehicles. We have to prevent any irresponsible vehicle owners from taking advantage of this system. Once the vehicle is deregistered, we won't be able to hold the owner concerned accountable. However, we will try to strike a balance. We will make sure that we will cancel the registration as long as we satisfy that the certain conditions are met. So yes, we will consider this. For owners who have left Hong Kong for a period of time, again, we will step up publicity to enhance people's awareness about this new regulation. Even if you are out of Hong Kong, you'll be able to receive our emails. We're also going to launch the new e-licensing portal. We welcome any vehicle owners to visit this platform. As long as you are in a place where there is internet, then you can log into the portal and you'll be able to receive information about your car. So I hope this portal will help. As to whether we're going to prosecute a certain vehicle owner, the DOJ will have to look at the evidence to make a prosecution decision. Of course, the court will also have a ruling. In terms of the figures, that is the administrative cost, well, we don't currently have this information in hand, and also different departments are involved. From 2021, since we have mounted these joint operations, we've been able to remove some 3,000 abandoned vehicles. It's hard for us to calculate the costs incurred because a number of departments are involved. 4 minutes for each member for the second round, Ms. Doreen Kong. I want to ask for some figures from the administration. Once this amendment regulation is passed, how many prosecutions do you estimate that you will instigate? I'm worried about the workload of the magistrates' courts. If you expect that there will be a very few number of prosecutions, of course, that wouldn't be a problem. When you drafted this regulation, you probably had a number of prosecutions in mind. Also, the administration said it has the right to exercise discretion when it grants exemptions. Are you going to have a set of guidelines? We need some elements of certainties. We cannot solely rely on the court to make a judgment. I hope that there can be some clarity or certainty before we enact this regulation. I want to know the criteria and standards to be adopted by the administration when it grants exemptions in the future. I've looked at the practices of other places. Which places in the world have you looked at when you came up with this amendment? I looked at the situation in Singapore. In Singapore, vehicles can be deregistered. It is clearly set out in their laws. They have a road traffic motor vehicles licensing law. In Section 35 of this law, it clearly sets out that their deregistered vehicles can be kept at private places or premises. I think this is a very straightforward approach. I'm fine that you come up with such a system or mechanism. However, you have to ensure that there are clear provisions which will give members of the public a clear idea. Mr. Mack. Thank you, Chairman. On exemption, as discussed, it is written in the regulation that if the Commissioner for Transport is satisfied that the owner has genuine difficulty to deal with the vehicle, then we will grant an exemption. There are two major principles that we abide by. First, if the vehicle will not pose safety hazards on road, we will grant exemption. Second, if the vehicle is kept properly by the owner, then the owner will get the exemption. So the guidelines that we're going to issue will evolve around these two major principles. We will also include examples and scenarios as reflected by members of the sector. Some cars are pending spare parts. Some cars are put at the dealership for sale. Also, there may be vintage cars that will not be used on the roads. These are concrete examples that may be included. We will include the relevant details in our guidelines to tell people under what circumstances they will be granted an exemption. We've talked to the administration of the judiciary to assess whether they will be able to take up the extra workload. I believe the judiciary will be able to handle the potential extra cases. From 2021 to the present, we removed some 3,000 dumped cars. We expect that the number will drop after the enactment of the amendment regulation. On overseas practices, let's see if the Transport Department can tell you more. Ms. Candy Kwok. As we drafted this amendment, we drew reference from practices of other places. On deregistration, there are two situations under which the vehicle can be deregistered. One, the vehicle is dismantled. Two, the vehicle is shipped out of Hong Kong. We have to ensure that the vehicle can no longer be used on the roads. Say the chassis of a car is removed, the car can still be kept at a private premises. So I believe there are some similarities between our approach and the Singaporean practice. Mr. Frankie Yake. I'm following up on Mr. Chen Xiu-hong's as well as Ms. Doreen Kong's questions. What the Deputy Commissioner said does not really address our questions. You have to follow up on the cases even if you grant exemptions. Say you allow an owner to deregister his vehicle and the vehicle is dumped on the street, then that won't solve the problem. Ms. Kong mentioned about the Singaporean practice. I believe the Singaporeans have taken into account cases where people dump their cars on the street. I believe there is a solution. You have to think about it carefully so that we don't cause nuisances to law-abiding citizens. I've talked to the Deputy Commissioner a number of times. If you look at other places in the world, you may see destroyed vehicles that get deregistered, but they can be relicensed at some point. I think this is part of the car culture. Say I get some parts of a car from a scrapping company and I modify the car to make it a new one. Can this car be relicensed? You're just ensuring whether the vehicle will be safe to use on the road. I have a friend who has a vintage car and the vintage car got fixed in Europe and the car got shipped back to Hong Kong and the car got relicensed. I think the existing provisions are outdated. You have to take into account the different scenarios. Well, this may not be relevant to the amendment regulation. Deputy Secretary. We will look into this. As mentioned, there will be an exemption arrangement. Mr. Chen asked whether we can deregister a vehicle entirely and whether this vehicle can be relicensed afterwards. We will think about this. Mr. Kwok Wai Keung. Thank you, Chairman. The aim of this amendment regulation is to tighten the registration and licensing regime to prevent abandonment of vehicles. So this target is clear. I understand that you're going to handle the vehicles after they are unlicensed for 2 years or more. Say it is a vintage car and it is unlicensed for 2 years. It shouldn't pose a problem because it's kept properly. What if it is just an ordinary car and it's dumped on the street without being licensed for 2 years? Under the current approach, how are these kinds of cars dealt with? Or within the 2-year period, how are you handling these cars? Say the latest owners of these cars do not license the vehicles. What are you going to do? Will there be heavy penalties? This may not directly be related to the amendment, but I want to see if the administration has factored this in.
Transport Department, please. For a car left deregistered for 2 years, and the car has been deregistered, So that car becomes a car with an owner who's unreachable. And when we find that in a joint operation, we treat that as a car without an owner. The highways department will have the car towed away to a center so that the car doesn't block the road. And when the owner cannot be found, the car will be auctioned off if the car remains valuable. In that case, we cannot go after the owner. We cannot hold the owner liable because we cannot find them. Before the new rule takes effect, the car gets deregistered automatically. The car gets treated like a piece of bulky waste. But even with the new rules, you still have to wait for 2 years before you notify the owner. So will there be actions taken within the 2 years? Or will the car be left on the street? You can issue fixed penalty tickets, but that's all. Now, with the new rules, we will no longer deregister cars automatically. We will still be able to link that car to an owner. We can find the owner and hold the owner liable. It's an owner, but the car is not licensed. You can still find the owner, so you can still issue fixed penalty notices. Mr. Porter. Chairman, let me be more specific. When I say private land, I'm saying putting that car on a private site the owner already has the right to use, say in a warehouse or a garage. When someone puts out a banner illegally, you can do something right away. But here for cars, you have to wait for 2 years. Shouldn't we take swifter actions? I'm not against this regime. I'm saying there's a better way, there's a more direct, effective way to do. Can we think of other ways? Can we find swifter ways to hold the culprits to account? Can we make the culprits pay for the costs of removing and handling the dumped cars? Now, I'm out of time, so I want to ask about the address. The government explained why use ordinary post. The reason cited is that in renewing the license, the owners have to provide address proof, and then you have the ECM electronic contact means. But let's look at CAP 374E. A person has to let the government know within 72 hours when there's a change in a key particular. But then people move a lot in Hong Kong. And this requirement about letting the government know within 72 hours about changes in key particulars, this rule has rarely been enforced. Have people been penalized for flouting this requirement? Is this option, is this choice of ordinary post appropriate, given what I've said? So can we first hear from the Transport Department? First, the question about the address. Indeed, the law states that you have to let the government know within 72 hours when there's a change in a key particular. When people renew their licenses, we require address proof. The approach now is about discretion. So we haven't really prosecuted anyone for failure to let the government know within 72 hours. That's because you have too many cases. Administratively, it's too costly. But it is the position of the law. And you don't enforce the law. And you cite that as a reason for your choice of ordinary post. How do you square that circle? So we will review this arrangement on whether we should be enforcing this penalty. We take a discretionary approach. So maybe you can step up publicity. E-ticketing is coming up. car owners and license holders have to provide an electronic contact means because there's a separate ordinance on that. The owner's email and phone number have to be verified. Mr. Tse invited us to take prompt action, that is, without waiting for 2 years. We want to give owners out of town for a long time, enough time to handle the car. But for joint operations, we don't wait. We continue with the joint operations. When we can find the owner, we can hold that owner liable during joint operations. We will keep up those efforts. 3 other members are waiting to speak for the second round, or maybe the third round. I need to extend the meeting. I will extend the meeting to 1 p.m. Mr. Chen Hockfeng. Thank you, Chair. I have a question. You have a car parked in a private car park. The car is left there for 2 years. The car, under the current law, becomes deregistered. The owner of the car park can dispose of the car because the car becomes ownerless. And then you can free up the space. But then with the new law, the car park owner cannot dispose of the car. So that car will keep taking up the space at the private car park. The car park owner can do nothing. So that owner will sustain indefinite losses. So what do we do about that situation? So that's a scenario-based question. Ms. Candy Kwok. For cars in private car parks and the owner fails to pay the parking fee, the car park owner should first try to identify the owner, and there's a mechanism for the car park owner to find the car owner. And the operation will have to be in line with the guidelines for use of the car park. The owner of the car has to indemnify the car park owner of the loss. The car park owner, we want to steer clear of the car to avoid legal liability. So the loss will continue for the car park owner. But then 2 years later, under the current law, when the car has no owner, the car park owner can dispose of that car. And the real car owner cannot go after the car park owner. But with the new law, the car park owner can do nothing. With the new regulation, you can trace the car to the car owner. So the car park owner can go after the car owner. What I've said happens. You see dust gathering over cars in car parks. So the car park owner will come to the transport department saying you cannot touch a car with an identifiable car owner. The law, as it stands now, allows the car park owner to dispose of the car. But then in the future, with new rules, the owner of the car park can only turn to the court, and there are no other options. Is that the case? As my colleagues from the TD said, there are rules for usage at the car park. There's a contract governing the usage of the parking space. So the usage of the car park will be subject to that contract. For car park operators with doubt about the new regulation, on whether changes to car parks protocol are needed, on what to do with cars with owners, those car park operators can come to us with questions, and then we can have a discussion about that. We don't want cars to take up the space at car parks, public or private. So we will help car parks with questions, and we can offer advice to give car parks a better sense of how the new regulation will work. Car parks will find a way to cope. So can the Transport Department issue guidelines for car parks? Otherwise, the cars with owners continue to take up the space. And then the car owner may complain of property loss when the car park tries to dispose of the car. We had that kind of cases in the past. So please give us some guidance in the future. The best you can do with cars left at the car park is that you can lock up the car, and that's it. Mr. Rincon. Chairman, you should go first. We're speaking for the third round. Go ahead. I ask the government which laws in foreign countries the government consulted. The reason is that we're taking a tortuous approach, a convoluted approach. We're asking law-abiding citizens to do more for the sake of lawbreakers. We're penalizing law-abiding citizens. For people with more than one car, with cars they don't use, they don't drive, and also car dealerships, there will be more hassle. We're taking a passive approach. We're not tackling dumped cars as an issue head-on. Now, the law-abiding players will have to apply for exemption. That's why I'm calling this approach passive. I want to see the problem of abandoned cars resolved. But if we do not get the exemption right, we're not making life easier for people and businesses. I'm not asking for a change right now. But I want to point out, in Singapore, they have two laws on this problem. First, Parking Places Act, 1974. When someone dumps a car on the street or elsewhere, the government has the power to have the car towed away or scrapped. The government there can penalize the owner, and even for a deregistered car, the government there can go after the previous owner. So can I invite the government to rethink this? Can we look at Singapore's example instead? When I was speaking for the second round, I brought up another law. There, people can put their unlicensed car in a private place. There's also a section on vintage cars. Let's improve our laws in the light of the laws in Singapore.
Deputy Secretary. Thank you, Chairman. The purpose of this amendment is to tackle the abandonment of vehicles through cross-departmental operations and penalty. The Ombudsman recommends that we resolve the problem at source. That's why we are proposing this amendment regulation. I thank Ms. Khan for the valuable comments. She provided some examples in Singapore, and we'll look into that. On vintage cars, we understand that there is a need for such cars. We want to make the exemption arrangement straightforward and simple. Perhaps, like Mr. Frankie Yik said, we can deregister those vehicles. We'll also see whether there'll need to be additional provisions. Any other members wish to speak? If not, we're coming to an end to the discussion on the policy. Legal advisor, anything to follow up on? Thank you, Chairman. We don't have any issues with the Chinese and English revised versions of the amendment regulation. Members, do we need to hold a public hearing or invite members of the public to provide written submissions? So far, we've got one submission from the public. It has been circulated to members. No need to hold a public hearing or invite members of the public to provide written submissions. Well, people can submit written comments anytime they want. We've had an in-depth discussion, so I guess there's no need to hold a public hearing. Let's move on to clause-by-clause scrutiny. Yes. Yes, I have extended the meeting. Yes, Ms. Chang. Road Traffic Registration and Licensing of Vehicles Amendment Number 2 seeks to amend CAP 374 Road Traffic Ordinance. We are introducing new penalty. Date of commencement. This regulation will commence based on a date set by the Commissioner. This is to allow vehicle owners sufficient time to acquaint themselves with the amendment. This also allows time for the Commissioner to come up with clear guidelines. We are amending CAP 374 subsidiary legislation E. Marked up copy, page 2. This is to amend section 15. It's about cancellation of registration for non-licensing. The registration will not come into effect after 15 days. Instead, after the issuance of the notice for 3 months, if the vehicle owners does not take the required action in accordance with Regulation 25A, the Commissioner will have the power to deregister the vehicle. The Commissioner can cancel the registration as well as assign the registration mark that was assigned to the vehicle to any other motor vehicle. Marked up copy, page 2. We're introducing Section 25A and Section 25B. Vehicle owners that have not licensed their vehicles for 2 years or more will have to relicense their vehicles not later than 3 months beginning on the date of the notice issued to them. If an exemption is granted, then the notice will not be applicable. Section 25B is about the right of registered owners to apply for exemption. Owners who get the exemption will not be subject to Regulation 25A. If the Commissioner is satisfied that it is not reasonably practicable for the owner to comply with the requirements, then the Commissioner may grant an exemption. Mr. Doreen Kong. It says here that the license can be cancelled. Does it include the exemption period? Yes. Section 25B, I'm looking at the Chinese version. It says that if the Commissioner is satisfied that it is not reasonably practicable for the registered owner to comply with the requirement. I don't think the Chinese version is well written here. The Department of Justice will have to rewrite it because it looks like a direct translation of the English. Well, DOJ, please take note of it. Please carry on. Page 4 of the marked up copy. This is to amend Section 60. It says that any person who contravenes Regulation 25A, bracket 3, commits an offense and is liable on a first conviction to a fine at level 3, and on each subsequent conviction to a fine at level 4, and to imprisonment for 6 months. This penalty level is set higher than the general cost of breaking up a vehicle. Any questions? Please carry on. Page 6 of the marked up copy. Clause 6 is to introduce the new Section 60AA. If the convicted person fails to pay the fine, then the magistrate will make an order directing the Commissioner to refuse to issue a driving license to the convicted person, or to take no actions on the receipt of a notice of transfer of ownership, unless and until the fine is paid by the convicted first person. Any questions? Yes, Ms. Doreen Kong. I think Section 60AA is a new arrangement. Under 60AA, a certificate of transfer of ownership has to be obtained. I mean, a certificate of clearance has to be obtained, and has to be obtained within 72 hours. Why 72 hours? What if there is a holiday? Public holidays is not counted towards the 72-hour period. Perhaps the Transport Department can supplement. Ms. Kwok. This applies to all the relevant provisions under the existing legislations concerning fixed penalty and other types of contraventions. Say a new owner wants to buy or sell a vehicle, he will have to check whether there are any penalties attached to the vehicles. If not, then the ownership will have to be transferred within 72 hours. We will check the record on our computer system as well. Mr. Chang Hop-Fong. So what is the difference between the current approach and the practice proposed here? 60AA bracket 2. States that the Commissioner has the right to not renew the driving license of a convicted person. Do we have the same arrangement under the current approach? Mr. Mack? We made reference to the existing legislations concerning fixed penalties. Say a person fails to pay a fixed penalty fine, then the court may order a refusal to renew the person's driving license. All the cars under the name of that person may not be renewed. Any other questions? If not, we have finished the scrutiny of the regulation. On the legislative amendment timetable, the amendment regulation will finish scrutiny by the 20th of November 2024 in the Legislative Council. We'll have to report to the House Committee. I will move a motion to extend the scrutiny period of this regulation to the 11th of December 2024. The deadline for making notice for amendment is the 4th of December 2024, and the date for us to report to the House Committee is the 29th of November 2024. There being no other matters, meeting adjourned. Thank you.